All right, let's try that one more time. My name is Ryan Castle with IBIS Optum, and I'm here to talk about the efficacy of supplements for COVID-19. So to give a quick rundown of how we're going to go about this, I figure it makes sense to look into the people who are involved in the research that we're going to be discussing, the research itself, what we found with that research, and then last and most importantly, why should you care about that? In terms of the folks who were behind this research project, the main drivers were myself, my long-term research partner and brother in all but blood, Bill Bushell, and Deepak Chopra, who's been a long-time collaborator and a very good friend. What we worked on was part of an IBIS Optum project in collaboration with the Whole Health Institute. And IBIS Optum, for those of you who are wondering, and if you weren't, I'm going to tell you anyway, we worked to try to bring research into the hands of everybody who might benefit from that cross-pollination. So we try to put public health policy into the hands of researchers. We try to put research into the hands of businesses. And we try to take the implications of both of those into policymaker decisions. One of the other things that we do is we initiate original research projects. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. IBIS Optum initiated an original research project. It was a systematic review and a meta-analysis looking into the relationship between COVID-19 and various treatments of it. We were really lucky to be able to put together an amazing team working on that. I can't believe the minds that we were able to bring to that. We were able to bring together some of the greatest folks that I've known, including the Dean of Harvard Public Health and leaders from the Whole Health School of Medicine, leaders in family medicine, epidemiology, public health. And we all worked together to try to make a project that was going to be as rigorous as possible, but that also was going to be impactful. Because too often research focuses on making sure that we can report quantifiable numbers, but we don't make that leap of what do you do with it? So that's what we tried to do here. But we did start with the necessities. We started with a meta-analysis of 6,000 studies, winnowing those down into more and more condensed information that we'd be able to draw concrete information on regarding inflammatory markers and COVID-19. Now, I don't expect that to make sense to everybody, but COVID-19 is primarily an inflammatory disease, or at least the worst effects of it are. And without getting into too much detail, I'm just going to have to go on a little bit of a tangent so this makes sense. The thing that makes COVID-19 so dangerous is the fact that when the virus enters the body, it triggers an inflammatory reaction, which is normally part of your body's healthy way of reacting to an infection or an injury. And cytokines release signals in your bloodstream, and that sends lymphocytes and other things to the area to try to stop whatever the infection or the damage is and repair it. The problem is COVID-19 stops the cytokines from shutting it off. So the inflammatory cycle just keeps going and going and going, causing a systemic chronic inflammatory disorder, which can lead to damage to the lungs, as most people are familiar with, but also the heart, the vascular system, the brain. Neuroinflammation is one of the main things that we're seeing as a side effect of long COVID. And that is in large part due to the fact that this inflammatory system never gets shut off. If we're going to be trying to track the effects of inflammation on something as widespread as the human body and the human immune system, we need to be able to quantify that. What are we looking for? So we tried to isolate out as many biomarkers as possible that are each used to track levels of inflammation in the body. And then we reverse engineered that and cross-referenced it to see what exactly are the negative effects that COVID-19 has on those markers, and then just as importantly, what are the effects of the treatments on those same markers? So if COVID is damaging, A through D, what effects are pharmaceuticals, nutritional supplements, behavioral health, what are they going to be having on each of those markers? Are they going to impact all four? Are they going to impact 1, 3? This was information that at the time was not widely known and really needed to be codified. We needed to understand what we were dealing with so that we could understand what would be effective. And so we tried to put together a report that was going to be able to report on objective quantifiable numbers. So everything in our study is statistical and based on molecular counts, cytokine levels, and erythrocyte sedimentation rates, everything that we can do to try to erase as much subjective assessment as possible and keep this just straight numbers, because this is an area that there's oftentimes far too much guesswork involved. And that's the reason why we focused on the markers as opposed to mortality rates. Because when you look at a mortality rate and the only thing you know is the person was infected with COVID, you're trying to guess everything that came between A and Z. And there's an entire interconnected system, a complex organism in between where a million things could happen. So we tried to focus 1 degree of separation on each level so that we could take a look and see all of these markers that you see right here are what we tracked. And the map that we see connecting them is a representation of those effects and the effect sizes. To spend a little bit more time on one more tangent, an effect size is an important factor because most people are familiar with, in any research paper, you have to focus on significance, or P. The problem with P is that it is generally zero sum. Something is significant or it isn't, and there isn't a scale to it. So to keep in with the theme of Food 2.0, let's say I'm starving to death and you sit me down in front of a steak dinner and 1 Tic Tac. If I have the Tic Tac, that is going to have a measurable effect on my hunger, as will the steak dinner. So according to, if we just looked at significance, those two things are both more or less interchangeable in terms of treatments for my starvation. Effect size would be looking at how much more the steak dinner is going to do for my hunger than the Tic Tac. And so that's what we focused on. So all of these lines that you'll see here connect different markers with different catalysts. And the catalyst can be whether it's COVID-19, the pharmaceutical interventions, which we focused on remdesivir, the standard of care, and tocilizumab, which at the time was part of the standard of care for COVID-19, as well as melatonin supplements, vitamin D3 supplements, and then also a behavioral health component of mindfulness meditation. Every line that you see going from one of those catalysts is a measured effect on one of the biomarkers surrounding. The biomarkers are all in blue. The size of the line connecting it is relative to the effect size. So a thin line means it had a very weak effect, a thicker line means it had a much stronger effect. I'm aware these maps are not the most intuitive, so I'm going to put it in a little bit of a different context. The size of the bubble is relative to the size of the impact on the markers, on these inflammatory markers that help tell us how much of a difference the treatment is making on the inflammatory system. So remdesivir, which is the leading drug used to treat acute infection for COVID-19, has a moderate effect on lymphocytes and a very large effect on C-reactive proteins. That's great. We would expect to see some kind of a large effect. It is one of the leading medications. When we take a look at tocilizumab, we see it only had a very small impact on C-reactive protein, and that again makes sense. Tocilizumab is no longer considered a viable treatment for COVID, doesn't have much of an effect. But now when we get into the supplements, we're going to see something very different. When we take a look at melatonin supplementation, the size of the impact on all three is as large as the largest effect from remdesivir. But as you can see, it obviously impacts more markers to a higher degree. When we combine that with vitamin D3 supplementation, we also see it is having very large effects, and again, more biomarkers impacted than with the standard of care. And then when we throw in a behavioral health component, such as mindfulness meditation, we start to see a systematic impact emerge. We start to see how a human organism can react as a whole when that system is affected, when the organism is experiencing a shift as opposed to an individual mechanism within that organism being targeted. So to put this in yet one other way of comparing it, The total biomarkers affected across the spectrum. When you look at the supplements in comparison to the pharmaceutical standard of care, the supplements affected 460% more markers than the standard of care. When you look at just the markers that are most dysregulated by COVID-19, meaning if we're just trying to focus on the markers that have been linked to COVID severity and see which interventions had the biggest impact on reducing those and reducing the markers that indicate COVID severity, the supplemental treatments were 260% more effective, or at least impacted 260% more markers. And then going back to the comparison between the steak dinner and the Tic Tac, if you're isolating out major impact, so leaving aside all of the small changes that, they might be significant, but they aren't monumental. They aren't going to shift the balance in an infection or in a course of health. If you're just focusing on large or very large effect sizes, the supplemental treatments were 700% more effective than the standard of care pharmaceuticals. I want to be very clear about one thing. I am not disparaging pharmaceutical standard of care. I am not discouraging anybody from taking proper drugs for a disease. These are things that, as I mentioned before, they do have an impact and they do have an effect. They have a role. But what I'm here to say, and this leads directly into my implications section, is they're one part of what should be a broader toolbox. And that leads us to implications, or as I like to say, the so what of it all. Like, that's all very nice. We did this research. We put together a bunch of very confusing graphs. What does it mean? Well, one of the things that it does is it helps put down in very concrete, objective, quantifiable metrics what a lot of other studies have indicated and a lot of other nutritional research has supported, which is vitamin D3. It is a fantastic immune booster. It is able to curb some of the growth of inflammation and help reverse it in some instances. And that's one of the reasons why, partially as with the contribution of this research, COVID-19 is now currently being treated with vitamin D3. Another element is melatonin. Most people are familiar with melatonin as a way to treat sleep disorders or to help with the soundness of sleep. What a lot of people don't know, and we hope that this research will help to spread the word on, is melatonin is actually a potent antiviral booster. And even more importantly, and this is relatively rare for most compounds in the body, melatonin actually has a capability to shut down inflammation once a viral load has been cleared, which there are very few mechanisms that we can add to the body which will improve its capability to have that on-off switch for inflammation. And finally, most people here, I imagine, are familiar with many aspects of behavioral health, improving metabolic efficiency, improving homeostasis, and reducing inflammation. This is borne out in this study. When you incorporate that, you're going to see a much larger impact in the overall organism. Now, the real takeaway in almost any healthcare decision, at least in the United States, is unfortunately cost. Sure, you might be able to say supplements, they can interrupt the dysregulation of COVID. They might be overwhelmingly more safe than most pharmaceuticals and are able to treat the effects of inflammation. But what about the price point? Well, the cost per dose of remdesivir is $390 per dose. Tocilizumab, which again is not currently in use, is far cheaper at $40 per dose. But vitamin D3 comes in at 10 cents per dose. And melatonin beats that by half, coming in at 5 cents per dose. So we're looking at an intervention which is safe, it is effective, it is able to impact the mechanisms that we know underlie the severity of COVID-19, and it comes at a fraction of the cost and is available to just about anybody who wants to take it up themselves. And I think that that is part of the reason why this research has garnered the attention that it has. Any research organization is dying for somebody to pay attention to what they're frantically screaming into the dark. Most of the time, nobody is. But we were able to, we touched a nerve with this one. And we got a lot of attention on it. And I cannot describe how grateful I am to that, because I feel like the findings that are in this paper help give people something actionable. They give people some agency in their own health. They tell them, here's something we found has some efficacy. But most importantly, you can do something about it. This isn't a highly dangerous, obviously talk to your doctor before changing any, regimen, but this is not a difficult to obtain treatment. It's not something that is pie in the sky. This is backed up by hard data. It's something that people can do to take charge of their lives, to be able to own a little bit more of their own health in a time when the world is full of insane, life-threatening diseases and world threats that oftentimes we have little to no control over. And that's really what I think all of this comes down to, is we need to try to find approaches that are affordable and practical. We need to understand that any approach to healthcare has to include nutrition and behavioral health. We need to embrace and promote the idea that healing and well-being is not about restoration to a status quo. If you catch COVID-19, the goal shouldn't be to return you to exactly where you were before you caught the disease. It should be to make you better than you were. Because if you caught the disease and had severe symptoms from it, you probably had a lot of comorbidities in the beginning. The overwhelming majority of this country has several comorbidities and chronic illnesses. We need to focus on making these things better than they were, not simply going back to it. And that, I feel, is at the crux of integrative medicine or whole health or whole person care or holistic medicine, wellness. All of these terms come with their own baggage. I'm not terribly comfortable with any of them, but I think they're all representative of the idea of a systems approach to health. And that's something that we really need to start looking at, to stop trying to find the perfect tool for a problem and understand we need to instead build a bigger toolbox so that we can find the right tool for the right issue. That's one of the things that we try to do at IBIS Optum. We try to live at the center of scientific research, business applications, policy decisions. We try to make sure that the findings of research are put into the hands of policymakers so that they can make responsible decisions and be able to put things like this into action to promote stuff like vitamin D3 subsidies or implementation into hospitals, which is now happening. We try to make policies and research discoveries that are going to be implemented through business by making it profitable for everybody to promote the health of every other partner in this triangle. And more than anything else, we try to make sure that no one of these sectors has to do it all alone. Scientists don't need to figure out all of the implementation and the policy decisions. Businesses don't need to recreate the wheel and discover all of the science. We try to help connect everybody who is a part of these programs so that they can all do something more efficiently and effectively. So I want to thank you all for bearing with me on this. Hopefully I did not bore you to too many tears. And I'll just wrap this up saying that I think we are all aware that there are a lot of storm clouds on the horizon, but I think that if we work together, and honestly I've been humbled by the amount of goodness of heart and hard work that I've seen at this conference, I think that we've got a good chance, and I wish all of you fair weather in a following sea. And I do notice that, yeah, we've got a few minutes, I think we have 5 minutes for a question, so yeah. I don't know, microphones.
Hi, I just want to say this was a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for this. I was wondering, how did you decide for meditation being one of the focuses for your research?
That is a very good question that it touches on probably 20 or 30 hours of acrimonious debate. Meditation, we wanted to include a behavioral health component. But the problem is that with a lot of them, if you look at specific diets or if you look at specific regimens of exercise, then you have a lot of confounders. You don't know if it was necessarily the practice or maybe the context, or who likes doing yoga every morning at 5 a.m. or who tends to engage in extreme diets or what have you. Mindfulness meditation was a widely researched enough topic that we were able to bring in hundreds of different peer-reviewed studies that had looked at a wide range of demographics and implementation, so that we felt comfortable that the information that we were pulling from the meditation studies was not going to be skewed or isolated. It was a good, large enough sample size to answer your question. Thank you. That was a great question.
Thank you.
In speaking with the third point on your triangle, the policy angle, if people remember at the beginning of the pandemic, this being a novel virus, there was a gross lack of data, period, about the virus other than general principles on the treatment of coronavirus species. With that, there were certain specialists in the virology field that were suggesting components such as vitamin D and melatonin, and we saw a lot of effort to suppress those type of treatments, which ended up creating a lag time in using things like
Tocilizumab.
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
can't tell you how long I had to practice saying
What are some policy proposals that might be pushed in both the supplement space, but also potentially the healthcare space, in possibly combating those sort of, frankly, as your study shows, non-scientific policies that were enforced at the very beginning of this endeavor, and maybe prevent future cases like that in the future?
That's another fantastic question. And yeah, it was very frustrating to see the almost instinctive pushback against any sort of a recommendation of, oh, hey, these nutritional supplements might have an effect. We've seen them have an effect in these previous studies, and the immediate pushback because of an entrenched idea of, oh, well, that's has to do with food and nutrition. That's not medicine. It's got nothing to do with it. In the same way that you get a lot of arguments about meditation, for instance. Well, that can't work. That only has to do with the mind. The mind's got nothing to do with the body. And obviously, these things aren't true on a quantifiable scientific basis. So in terms of what do we do going forward, that's a much bigger question than I have time to discuss up here on stage, but I would say the thing that I was clamoring for the entire early part of the pandemic was some sort of a body that was able to look at experimental research in a regulated, quantifiable, highly objective, rigorous manner. Whereas right now, we have either the wilds of peer-reviewed research, which is a fantastic system, but it is a wilderness and it's a chance whether something's going to be picked up and noticed, or you have government regulatory bodies who are extremely cautious and reluctant to do anything innovative. So I would say something in between there, some sort of a subsidized body to look into approaches that are able to present bodies of evidence and say, this is outside the wheelhouse of the standard of care, but we think it should be considered under these circumstances. That would be my preference. Yes, please.
So that was actually going to be related to my question as well. So, first of all, thank you very much. The data are very compelling, excellent presentation. I think that the challenge we face, and me being in the pharmaceutical industry for about 25 years and running controlled studies, the Food and Drug Administration has very defined parameters for the development of drugs. The unfortunate thing is that the nutrition supplement food community has struggled because there have not been objective measures in some ways. When there have been objective measures, they haven't been able to be implemented because there's not funding to support the controlled trials. So the question was asked, why wasn't this implemented? The bottom line is because the controlled trials weren't done. And there needs to be some driving force. The pharmaceutical industry has a financial driving force. Right or wrong, there's a lot of people, and I hope I consider myself one of them, in that field that was trying to push it for the right reasons, but it did have financial backing.
And so I think there's really, two parts to that, and that was going to be my question for you. You mentioned about some agency. Do you have ideas on that? Would it be the CDC? Would it be private foundations?
That is a much longer question that I would very much like to take up with you offline, but short answer, yes, I think that that is something that needs to be a blend of private industry and government regulation and oversight, because I think that's the only way. I agree, but you can't expect scientists all over the world to be able to put together large-scale clinical studies without any sort of financial backing that are able to meet extremely high standards to be able to reach approval. But in this pandemic, I feel really illustrated the fact that we need to be able to have a more flexible and adaptable framework to be able to approach these things, to be able to test these ideas, to be able to have, hopefully, a standardized set of metrics. If you can meet these metrics, if you can, track these effect sizes with this level of significance and be able to have this all be, open access so everybody can review the information and ensure, like I said, it's a much longer conversation, but I think it is possible. I think it's something that would have to evolve as a joint project with a number of different entities, but I think it not only can be done, I think it has to be done. Is there anybody else? Or actually 2 minutes over, so thank you all very much. I really appreciate it.